2023 was absolutely stacked with hit titles, from Spider-Man 2, Armored Core 6, Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and all the way back to Tears of the Kingdom. But 2023 offered more than just AAA titles. It was also the year of the Souls-like. Remnant 2, Wolong Fallen Dynasty, Lies of P, and my most anticipated game of the year, Lords of the Fallen. A game that had all the makings of being my all-time favorite Souls-like game. A grim, dark world of knights and monsters with themes of spiritual corruption and enough variety of player expression to hit the familiar taste and tone of what defines a proper Souls-like game. Its hype was swinging hard for Souls fans, and with the promise of giving us a controversial yet beloved invasion and co-op system. So despite all of this hype and the fair amount of time I put into the game, I find myself unable to recommend it to people looking for those previously described experiences. So what went wrong? We're going to dissect this game and break it into 14 parts for this review. Level design is sort of a broad term and really needs to be broken up into three pillars that make up level design: world design, level design, and encounter design. Let's start with world design. The interconnected world of Lords of the Fallen is very reminiscent of Dark Souls 1. To this day, I still praise Dark Souls 1 as having the best world design in a Souls game. Multiple areas lead back to each other and are layered in a way that gives you this small feeling but on a massive scale. You can tell they put a lot of attention into bringing this map to life. Unfortunately, this beautiful world design is hurt by having undesirable level design. Map progression in an exploration-focused game contributes to having a pleasurable experience if it is implemented clearly and concisely. Using Dark Souls 1 as an example, when you ring the bells, you know that Sen's Fortress opened and how to get to it. You know this because it's placed in a spot that the player is familiar with. It is located next to a blacksmith, there is a bonfire, and the location sits at the intersection of multiple major areas. It is assured the player will have spent time in this location. In Lords of the Fallen, the player is constantly required to backtrack through levels in order to progress to their next area. I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing, but the locations you are required to backtrack to aren't defined by clear landmarks, so this becomes a frustrating experience. It's not game-breaking by any means and doesn't ruin the experience enough to suggest this interconnected world doesn't work properly, but it ruins the sense of the world because navigating becomes a chore. This is further exacerbated by the next point. Thirdly, we have encounter design. This is the weakest pillar of Lords of the Fallen's level design. The problem with this game's encounter design is every module is filled with small enemies that can do half of your health bar in one attack, take multiple hits to clear out, and have limited movesets. Examples include Umbral Remnants, Pilgrims, Manglers, and beyond. In Souls titles, there are areas that use number advantage to overwhelm the player. These areas stick out in the minds of Souls players as unique experiences that require the player to problem solve how to tackle the number advantage. Examples that come to mind are the Buffed Hollows and the Undead Parish before the Gargoyles fight in Dark Souls 1, and the Bone Wheel Skeletons in the bottom of the Catacombs. In both examples, there are strategies the player can learn to beat the area. In Undead Parish, you can utilize the small choke point to take out enemies one by one or in a group. In the Catacombs, you can either strafe the Bone Wheels or bait them into a wall to get a chance to attack them. In Lords of the Fallen, there are just a mass of enemies, and the environment is never an asset. This would not be an issue if this was done sparingly. However, there's not a single module you step in where you're not fighting 4 or more tanky enemies at a time. I was trying to think of specific areas that were especially egregious, but I really can't pick one. They all run together as the same experience. The only area that sticks out to me as being particularly bad was Mance of the Hollowed Brothers. And not because it was a different experience, but because it feels like every module was a copy and paste of the last. 1 or 2 archers, 2 to 4 small enemies, and a big enemy. That is very weird. Dude, I swear this entire last area, this is what happens. You know, okay, you know like the first level of Undead Burg? When you walk up the platform right when the dragon lands, and there's 3 guys sitting there, and 1 guy with a crossbow shooting down. An iconic moment in DS1. Every single module of this area has had range guy and then like a few little guys. And the range guy is the only thing that's a threat. It's like, give me some variety, please. All right, let's ask ourselves, where's the range guy? Where's the, oh, there he is! Look at that! There he is! And look! The module is the exact same! It's a few little guys, 1 guy shooting from across. On my first playthrough, I always try to clear every zone because exploration is meant to be an enjoyable attribute. Not in this game. After I made it 40% of the way through the game, I stopped doing this because fighting enemies became a chore rather than a challenge. Exploring the world didn't feel rewarding, and the difficulty wasn't worth spending extra time. Due to all of this, I ended up running through most of the world as a result, and I don't feel ashamed one bit by admitting that. The world is beautiful, but intensely frustrating to navigate. The artists, 3D modelers, musicians, and voice actors who worked on this project need to be praised and then some. These individuals carried the game on their backs. The world is immersive. I really love the themes and aesthetics of Fife of the Chill Curse. Pilgrim's Perch was beautiful, and I also really enjoyed Lower Calrith and Revelation Depths. As you progress through the game, you little by little unravel the story of how Mornstead fell into chaos. Through the lore stigmas, you got to see how every boss was corrupted and how every character started to find out something was wrong but too little too late. The buildings, the enemies, the attention to detail is nothing short of superb in this game. You really feel like you're in this hopeless world filled with areas with unique themes and characteristics. The world looks and feels alive. The scope of the world is so very big, and we as the player are so very small. The armors are detailed, the weapons range from ornate to brutalist. The game has some of the best fashion and weapons I have seen in a Souls-like. The voice acting was great, the characters felt real and memorable. Just as movies should be praised for the elements that make up a movie, such as set design, writing, music, etc., video games that tell a story should be praised on these attributes as well, and they did such a good job here. This is a short section, but one I have to make a specific mention of. This game has incredible lore. The moral ambiguity and background story of this world is exactly what I was looking for. Its major and even subtle subplots add to the world's immersion and sense of world building that hits the familiar mark of a Souls-like. I touched on level design, and we cannot talk about level design without talking about Umbral. The lamp mechanic being able to peer into this underworld that is simultaneously stacked on top of it is such a unique and great idea. To add icing to this cake, if you hold your Umbral lamp up next to an enemy in Umbral and they attack you, you can be pulled into this underworld. I love this idea so much. Bravo to the individuals who thought of this idea. It separates this game really well stylistically from other Souls-likes. The idea of Umbral is so good. Unfortunately, this is where the game's praises come to an end. And Umbral is a perfect example of how this game looks pretty, but when you take off the makeup, you start to see its imperfections. I praise the idea of Umbral, but the way the game mechanic functions in practice isn't well thought out. Looking into Umbral is cool, but it also makes the game suffer from the issue of making visual information something that cannot be trusted by the player, and making movement through levels a more tedious affair than it needs to be. The game's enemy density is unrewarding, which we will talk more about in depthly later, but in Umbral it adds to this problem. Then there is the respawn mechanic of having 2 lives, similar to Sekiro. I actually like this idea, adding an extra layer of difficulty to make the player feel pressured to hold on to that first life, and having that extra life gives the player a minute to learn in the event they make a critical mistake, but also still being punished for that mistake. Then there's the Umbral Lamp's utility in a fight. To start, making it something that needs to be swapped in order to use your ranged option, like a catalyst, provides a small buffer to your moment-by-moment decision making and doesn't feel fluid. Then there's the combat aspects to the lamp that are also pretty niche. You can use it to soulflay enemies, which on paper sounds really good and useful, but from my playthrough and the playthroughs I've watched of others, almost no one uses this mechanic. It's only practical in 2 scenarios. 1, you have an enemy you want to throw off a ledge. Or 2, there is an isolated bigger enemy that you can temporarily make them not attack for a small moment. The first example you only reserve for bigger enemies because smaller enemies you can just kick off, and even then most areas don't have a ledge. The second hardly ever happens because the enemy density packed into these levels is so great, you usually aren't isolating enemies unless you entirely restructure how you approach progressing through a level, and I don't enjoy forced pacing because ultimately it reduces player expression. You never feel like you're progressing in this game because everything scales with you. All non-boss enemies in this game seem to be scaled in a way to die not in the amount of damage you're doing, but the amount of attacks you do to them. I can categorize the enemies in this game into 3 bins: small enemies, big enemies, and damage sponges. Small enemies such as your Umbral remnants, avowed soldiers, pilgrims, dogs, manglers, etc. are always 2 to 4 attacks to kill at every stage of the game. Your big enemies, such as your Pure Blades, Bellbros, Cageheads, Kingrar Guardians, etc., are all 6 to 8 hits. Your damage sponges, such as Infernal Enchantress and Womb of Despair enemies, can take anywhere from 9 to 15 attacks. These ratios change slightly depending on your build and if you're using an element that is strong against certain enemies, but these variables change only slightly. Health scaling is also broken. You can get 2-shot by enemy attacks despite having the Vitality soft cap of 40. If you've completed this game, you will surely remember the Ice Archers and Fife of the Chill Curse. If you have any Frost buildup whatsoever, have fun getting one-shot by an automatic hit scan enemy wielding a Barrett 50 caliber sniper reskinned as a bow. Then there's the disparity of damage between bosses and basic enemies. Dogs will do half your health bar in one hit, and late game bosses might as well be equipped with a wiffle bat. The beauty of Souls-likes is that you can choose any build you want and make them work. In Lords of the Fallen, you are playing at a severe disadvantage if you don't spec into some type of elemental damage. My first playthrough, I did a pure strength build utilizing the Crimson Rectored Sword and Angel's Axe to crush my enemies, and it was nothing short of a miserable experience. In a Stolovsky interview with the developer explained how scaling works in Lords of the Fallen PvP, and they said there is an average hit amount that is tied to the type of weapon that you were using.
What about the do you guys have level-based matchmaking, or is it just, does it just scale?
The way it works is you can PvP against anybody of any level. It doesn't matter. It doesn't care what the level is, because what it's trying to do is there's a curve that's assigned to both of you, and you're both basically trying to get evened out to the same area. So essentially that area is, cool. I think it's 12 or 13 hits to kill somebody, like on average, by the way. So if you have a bigger weapon, it could be like 9. If you have a smaller weapon like daggers, it could be like 18 or 20 or something like that. I don't. So basically, we have basically a power level system in the background that's running. So it's taking your current level plus your highest weapon level, that not equipped, just that you have. Period.
I can't confirm this, but I think this is also how PvE is scaled in this game. This is why you see many enemies stopping at 1% and needing another attack in order to finish them off. This is pretty good, I would say. Yep. And this always constantly, so what you see right here, this happens constantly. I have a maxed out weapon, and even when I had a level 7, so it's 10 is the max. When I had a level 7, that was also happening. I don't know, it's weird how damage is calculated in this. I did some experiments with different weapons to test this theory, and it 100% checks out. This might be confirmation bias, I can't tell for sure, but I'm curious if other players have noticed this in their playthrough. It feels like the only true way you can problem solve in this game is by mixing projectiles into your playstyle, which if true, this is another example of how player expression is constrained. This is fine if that is how the developers intend for you to play the game, but this needs to be messaged clearer than simply throwing a rock at a hanging body to get an item in the tutorial. When you make a character in an RPG, you usually work on specializing that character. In this game, your build making needs to be a bit of everything, which makes the role-playing piece to this game contradictory to the Souls-like experience. There are 128 weapons in this game, excluding ranged weapons. This seems like a great number with tons of options to choose from. This would suggest there is a lot of player expression to be had, but this is only an illusion. Every weapon shares the same exact moveset in its weapon class. All grand hammers share the same moveset, all short swords share the same moveset, and so on. There are rare exceptions to the rule, but 95% of the time this is the case. So this large number of 128 actually feels more like 12 because there's 12 weapon categories. This is even worse if you want to dual wield your weapons. Your dual wield moveset is defined by what is in the player's right hand, and it seems that the game categorizes your weapon as either a big weapon or small weapon, which makes the wide variety of weapons seem like only a reskinned few. One of the bigger head scratches in this game is how enemy poise was implemented. Using a medium weapon like the Crimson Rector's Sword, it seems like smaller enemies can get staggered with weapon attacks, and larger enemies just cannot. When you're fighting a bigger enemy, and especially a boss, the game just feels like a robotic turn-based fighting game. Wait for the enemy to attack, 1 or 2 hits, and reset. The argument could be made that this is also what happens in traditional Souls titles, but enemy AI in a Souls game will let you know when you can sneak an attack and when to be patient. In Lords of the Fallen, with the way the enemy AI works, there isn't much room for experimentation. Archers and enemy attacks seem to rarely miss and have gap closers that immediately zip to you without chance to miss. This isn't me complaining the game is hard, this is me saying that the game is predictable. Painfully predictable. A great deal of player expression is in positioning and AI manipulation. None of this is allowed in Lords of the Fallen. You can make the argument that the parry system trivializes this, but my question is, what is incentivizing players to go for parries? Even if you perform a perfect parry, the game still punishes you with gray health, and even if you break the posture of your enemy and get the riposte, the damage you do to the enemy is minuscule at best, especially on bosses. The most effective way to tackle this game, if you don't want to lean heavily into projectiles, is playing the waiting game, and it makes the game feel very sluggish and tedious. Enemy variety in this game somehow manages to be okayish and really bad at the same time. There are 50 different types of enemies you will fight in Lords of the Fallen. This seems like a decent variety, but when you realize that a large chunk of them are just reskin versions of the same enemy, making almost half the enemies in this game a reskin. Speaking of limited player movesets, the enemies in this game also have a ridiculous amount of reused attacks, making the variety of this game's enemies feel like you're fighting the same enemy over and over again throughout your playthrough. Another thing to notice with a lot of the enemy movesets is almost all of them are extremely clunky and telegraphed. If you isolate any one enemy, I found that only a few of them are tough and engaging. The bosses in this game are unfortunately one of the lowest points of the game. Since the Dark Souls 1 DLC, tough boss fights are what makes these games stand out. The same cannot be said about Lords of the Fallen. All of them are easy and unchallenging experiences. To make it worse, the HP bar is far longer than the novelty of the movesets. The fights get stale fast because you are repeating the same experience with no variation. In the first dev stream with Fightin' Cowboy, there was a dedicated section they had planned for giving tips and tricks to beating bosses that players were struggling with. This was the result.
I know one that we wanted to hit, since a lot of people are struggling. Chat, sound off. There's a particular boss that you're struggling with. We're going to share some tips for that boss, and while we wait for
everything we want to do.
Looking at some other questions, nobody's asking any things about bosses, so instead let's go to a different one.
The same formula of wait for enemy attack, step to the side, swing once or twice, rinse repeat is the same formula for beating every boss in this game. It's just a turn-based fighting game where there is no sense of surprise in the movesets. There's almost no variation, limited options, and most bosses don't have a run cycle to force engagement. There's no extra problem solving needed in this game to beat a boss. Another blemish for these boss fights is the bad area denial mechanics that many of them share. Instead of forcing me into an uncomfortable spot with area denial, bosses just throw area denial out in areas that I didn't need or care to be in the first place. Another weird decision was adding in scripted events in bosses that served no real purpose other than to waste the player's time and stretch out fights. I'm not against scripted events like this, but this is just another case of a minor annoyance that adds to the pile of many. As we talked about earlier, enemies aren't that interesting and difficult on their own, but it's a Souls-like, so the game has to be difficult. Instead of making the fights engaging experiences, they created difficulty in other ways. The first and most noticeable example of how difficulty was attempted to be achieved was by having high enemy density. Using Upper Blighttown in Dark Souls 1 and Shrine of Amana in Dark Souls 2 as examples, these areas were challenging but didn't require enemy density. They required the player to learn in order to overcome the area. Since every zone is enemy dense in Lords of the Fallen, there is no sense of encounter design. I've seen some people call others soft for thinking the enemy density was a problem. I get where you're coming from in this line of thinking, but if that overwhelming swarm of enemies is the difficulty and not the enemies themselves, to me there's nothing of substance because there is no problem solving, because you are faced with the same problem. It feels like a chore to get through a level cutting down tens of mobs in each module rather than an enriching battle. Food for thought. If there wasn't something that detracted from the game experience, why did the developers go back and change it? A large chunk of this feedback is coming from Souls veterans. We aren't a stranger to games being tough, but the same toughness with no variation or iteration is boring. Another way difficulty is added to this game is, as I mentioned before, in character progression scaling. Or in this game's case, it almost feels like the health bar doesn't matter, but it's calculated on number of attacks depending on weapon type, as we talked about before. If the optimal way of playing with a non-projectile focused strength build is that robotic turn-based fighting style, the fights are just a tedious chore rather than a challenge. You might say, well, the game obviously wants you to do projectiles. It's your own fault for not using them more. That's totally fine, and if that is the developer's vision, so be it. but player choice be damned, I guess. At least in other Souls titles that required the player to use options exterior of your build, you were given the solution on the spot. Take, for example, the Great Serpent Hunter Spear in Elden Ring and Storm Ruler in Dark Souls 3. To wrap up this section, the lock-on system in this game is garbage. It doesn't matter if you are looking directly at an enemy. It seems to be programmed in a way where it prioritizes certain elements and enemy types rather than the thing you wanted to focus on. I can see enemy priority being a feature, but in a game enemy dense as this, the lack of control is infuriating. This will be another short section, but a huge one to consider if you want to buy this game. The online is pitiful and a complete afterthought to this game. It's so bad, I had a friend of mine explain in a 27-minute video conversation of why this game's online mode doesn't work and most likely will never function properly. As an online-focused player when it comes to Souls games, this was the nail in the coffin for me to even remotely enjoy the game for any extended period of time. You cannot have a good online experience in this game unless you are co-op invading someone that's practically in your neighborhood. And even then, it's somehow a worse experience than a Souls game. And Souls titles aren't exactly revered for their netcode, to put it lightly. This goes without saying, but spoilers ahead, so if you want to not be spoiled, skip to this timestamp if you don't want to be spoiled. There are 3 endings to Lords of the Fallen pertaining to the 3 gods of this world. You can side with Aureus, which if you have cleansed a single beacon in this game, you are locked into this ending, which most players will probably do on their first playthrough. You can side with Adir by not cleansing any beacons, and you can do the Putrid Mother's Umbral ending, which also includes not cleansing a beacon, and you must perform an incredibly convoluted quest line to complete. Which isn't a bad thing necessarily, and I welcome hard secret endings like this, but seriously, good luck doing this naturally without a guide. I want to focus on the Aureus ending because that's the ending that 90% of players will experience. The ending to this game is so insultingly bad, I've watched players, myself included, lower their overall review score of the game just by how bad it is. The idea is, you beat the Monarch of Mornstead, which by the way, I beat on my first try, very tough game, get owned by hammers. Then you go into Adir's realm to fight the evil god himself, only to find out that fighting a literal god in this game consists of killing a couple lowly peasants who shoot the occasional fireball at you. Chuck a couple more hammers at this Craigslist version of the Dark Souls 3 Deacons of the Deep fight, and the game just ends. The cutscene before you enter this fight is Adir saying, "Talk to me, and I'll explain the truth of how you have been brainwashed and that I'm actually the good guy." Players like myself would think, oh, goody, let's get some good dialogue to really understand the motivations behind Adir's plan, and maybe if he convinces me, I can choose to side with him last second. Except there's no conversation at all. You immediately start the boss when you enter the room, and the entire time you are throwing hammers at his already half-dead worshippers, he is blabbering nonsense that you can't focus on because you are having fireballs shot at you the whole time. I simply can't imagine the dev team being proud of this ending. In the gaming industry, we're tragically plagued with the problem of games releasing in unfinished states. Lords of the Fallen suffers this same unfortunate fate. I've gotten stuck in walls, gotten bosses stuck in walls. Even on the developer stream, they managed to get stuck in a wall. Some walls have 0 collision, some attacks have 0 wall collision, damage scaling on weapon runes that don't display properly, and because the game uses Unreal Engine 5, it's a massive GPU and CPU hog. A lot of PC rigs can't run this game properly, even with decently up-to-date gaming rigs. A friend of mine who has a 2080 Ti graphics card and an i9 9900K CPU with 64 gigs of RAM couldn't run this game without frame rate drops and being on all low settings. There's more work to be done in this game. But luckily, there's updates coming out that are addressing these problems, which leads me into my next section. I've said mostly negative things about this game up until this point, but I am hoping I will be wrong in the long view. Hexworks has shown time and time again, both before the release of the game and post-release, that they care about us as players. They are willing to talk to the community and listen to player feedback. They're willing to hop on podcasts with content creators. They set up a content creator Discord specifically for feedback. And as someone that's in this Discord, I can confidently say they're working rapidly to fix bugs that we find and change game mechanics when we point out their shortcomings. The fact that they are keeping an open ear to this community is huge, and they have my respect for this. They're coming out with almost daily patches, sometimes twice a day, to quickly handle the feedback we are giving them. I have nothing bad to say about this development team. This is not the first and will not be the last game that has been released in an incomplete and unpolished state. Game developers are notoriously rushed and crunched to meet deadlines and releases. This game could have been a core part of this channel, which is why it pains me deeply to have gotten such a rushed and unfinished product. If the online mode even remotely worked, I would have been doing nothing on this channel but Lords of the Fallen until Elden Ring DLC. Instead, I got 1 week's worth of entertainment that felt more like I was completing a chore rather than playing a video game for leisure. The dedicated Souls community is desperately looking for a game to be a decent competitor to From Software, because as of today, there just isn't anyone else moving the needle to evolve the Souls genre. That desperation, at least in my eyes, has a marked effect on the criticisms levied at Lords of the Fallen. I believe that Lords of the Fallen is an ambitious title, but is found wanting in numerous areas. I sincerely hope that the devs can learn from this game and refine their ideas in the future, but there is a great deal of work to be done. I can't give this game anything higher than a 5 out of 10. And that's coming from someone who came into this with rose-tinted glasses and was offered a game key by the developers. I want to be wrong. I would love for Hexworks to make me eat my own words in the coming updates, but it will never excuse the poor launch of this title. If you've made it this far into the review, I want to say thank you. If you found this video fruitful in any way, it would mean a lot if you liked, commented, and maybe even dropped a sub with the bell if you like the way I make these videos. All support means a lot. Lastly, an even bigger thank you to those who helped me develop this script into a better version of itself. I don't deserve anyone's support, so the fact you're willing to provide it without incentive is something I'm truly grateful for. So yeah, that wraps up the Lords of the Fallen review. If you're curious more about any of my content, you'll find that I'm actually primarily a Twitch streamer. You can go find me over there at twitch.tv/itsmontage. I'm there live 5 days a week, so if you're watching this and it's in the evening for you, there's probably a good chance that I'm live, so come say hi. I'd love to see you. Right gang. We are the best.